Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the beginning of our afternoon sessions. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming because we have such richness to enjoy that I'm sure we're going to have a very lively afternoon. My name is Aretha Van Herk. I am co-organizer with Crystal Verdun of this amazing congregation. I want to say thank you as well to our colleague co-organizers, Megan Beaton, Andrea Beverly, and Erin Wunker, as well as many student assistants who have provided us with marvelous support. I want to thank especially Mount Allison University and President Campbell for his support. As well, I want to thank my university, the University of Calgary, and President Elizabeth Cannon for their support. We also want to thank SSHRC, which has provided us with support for this conference too. When you begin to imagine an event, you never know what that imagination will give birth to. But from last night and this morning, I think you have already seen that there is amazing work being done and amazing work to be done. So imagine with us as these women engage with some questions that are central to the way we regard women and their public voice in Canada. Imagine what you would like to see us do in future, and imagine what you can do in the present time. So our moderator for this panel is Crystal Verdun. She is going to begin with introductions, and we will proceed. Thank you again.
Let me know if you can't hear. I think it's on. Well, thank you, Aretha. And just a word about the format that we're going to use. It is interactive. We're going to have first have some Q&A up here with some questions, but then we do hope that we can open up to a larger dialogue. We know the space is big, but on the other hand, Con Hall, as it's familiarly known here, is a space that people can come in and out of in a quite a relaxed way. You can sneak in the back, you can sneak out again. So we thought that this was a good venue for a public discussion. Sometimes people get lost on campuses. It turns out university campuses are some of the most confusing and scary places to find rooms if you're not from that university. So Con Hall is familiar, and that's what we're going to do. And the whole afternoon will unfold in this way with just short turnarounds, 15 minutes between the panels. The idea was not that we'd have these huge breaks, but rather we just have 3 amazing panels, and this is number 1 with the 3 speakers that we have. Now, I won't take time to talk about the many accomplishments of these panelists. We've prepared literature to that effect. Here and there are a few little mistakes and typos. Please ignore. This has been a big group project, and the essential is we have the speakers here in person. Thank you for coming. It's just, it's a busy time of year, and you've come from various places away and busy lives. As an organizing team, we decided that each of the panels would address different questions, but we would all address one question. So we'll start with that, and that is, take a few minutes to say what the topic of the conference, so just to repeat it, Discourse, Dynamics, Canadian Women as Public Intellectuals, what that means to you. We know that the word public intellectual is prickly. It's not a term everyone likes. Part of the reason for talking about it is to explore why, but we also don't want to spend all our time on that. So what perhaps is a better question is, what does this whole event mean to you? And we'll start with that. We'll start with Dion.
Okay, well, the way you just described that word, those 2 words rather, at first I felt prickly about them, but then you defended them, so then I thought, well, no, I think I should defend them. At any rate, I think there are kind of 2 readings or 2 possible renderings of this title of the entire conference. And I just want to, what occurs to me in thinking about the topic are the number of problematics that are trying to reconcile themselves within the title, the positionings of the adjectives like, Canadian and public, and the brackets and limits that those things kind of represent. And so, so perhaps perhaps that's good. That suggests a kind of unease with these notions that kind of lay in this phrase, if you will, and it's an unease that I'm assuming the conference tries to unravel. If it doesn't, I don't think we should ever quite unravel them, but neither should we be satisfied with them. The other thing that occurred to me in thinking about it was the word involuntary. That if I fit into any of those things, it's an involuntary way, and that speaks to my own relation to the topic. My own responses as a writer of discomfort out of which writing comes, and the positioning of writers within the culture that we live in, which is an uncomfortable one, and can meet with incredible aggression and opposition as well. And then my own relationship to that notion of being a writer, of therefore speaking into the world, and trying to find both comfort and discomfort, and writing out of comfort and out of discomfort. So briefly, I'll stop there and say those are some of the things that came up for me in looking at the title.
And not knowing what others had said, that word comfortable and uncomfortable did come up in conversations as we prepared for the panel. It is an uncomfortable word, for many women at least. So Mary.
Well, speaking entirely personally now, I must say that the title Public Intellectual brought to mind something that I hadn't thought of for a long, long time, and that is the literature on women and the imposter syndrome. Right. Because I'm thinking, I don't really belong there. And of course, one of my friends said to me, well, you're public, but you're not much of an intellectual. So, of course, she was one of the prime correspondents in my email about the imposter syndrome. And so I'm thinking, well, yes, I don't seek this position. Already, though, having attended the presentations this morning, I see sometimes this is a label that is put on you by others, by the media, for example, or by other opinion leaders, or what have you, that it's a much more complicated thought than originally I had believed. And so let me just take one more personal note and say, I have always worked within the strictures of being an advocate in the legal system, which means I don't speak to the public, I speak to judges. And when my work involves making a public message, the clients make it. And indeed, my longest standing client, the Native Women's Association of Canada, has always referred to me as a technician. Oh. And recently, I have thought I have to break out of that designation of technician, specifically in the context of the Native women's work, because there is a really great need for people who accept the idea of being a settler to talk about that and to take positions on it and to interrogate other settlers in public discourse so that we can achieve something by way of reconciliation, because so much has been done by Indigenous peoples on their side of this discourse, but very little has been done on the part of settlers. And so I see I could become a participant from the settler side in this discourse. And so I am very grateful to have the opportunity here to learn more about being a public intellectual, about speaking, about holding ground in public debate, which can often be nasty or involve the hurling of bricks. So I'm regarding this as a learning experience, and I've forgiven myself for being an imposter.
Janice.
Let me start by saying that I've known Mary a long time, and she's never been an imposter.
The real deal.
I'm going to start by saying that the term public intellectual is a deeply problematic term for reasons that are actually not made clear in the abstracts. So I'm going to focus for the moment, unless I'm pushed to the wall by some of you, I'm going to focus on public, because that's a concept that everybody has an intuitive understanding of, but it's worthwhile stopping for a minute, because it's so central to this conference, right? So I would really ask 3 questions, and it comes out of the theme of last night, which was conversations. We had a wonderful treat from 7 women who talked about what conversations mean. So my question really, as I thought about this topic, is what does it mean to have a conversation? And then you can go 2 ways, in public or with the public. And those are 2 very different questions and mean something very different. Regardless of which way you go, I think you need there are 2 critical requirements for any kind of conversation with the public or in public. And both of these in Canada at this moment are challenged. The first of these is you need some space. You need space to have the conversation. Where is that space today? To me, the answer is not obvious, and it would be worthwhile talking about, actually, where are appropriate safe spaces to have public conversations, either with the public or in public. And the second one is actually even more difficult, and you're going to forgive me, all right, when I take just a minute or 2 to put this on the table and hope to enrage some of you. Because that is, to me, a critical part of public conversation, to actually enrage people. It's language. Conversation somehow involves, as we heard last night so brilliantly, 2 things. Talking to people, but as Sheila Rogers put it, listening to people. And it's from that kind of intimate engagement that you get a conversation. My own field, political science, has virtually lost the capacity to have that kind of conversation because it writes in language that is inaccessible to the public. It uses terminology that the public can't understand. So we have in my department some of the most brilliant political theorists who are concerned with democratic theory, but they write for 500 others. And the public is excluded from that conversation, even though it's about how do we make our democracy more vibrant. This morning, I deliberately went to all 4 panels, and my field is not literature or critical literature or film studies or biography or history, but I'm in that capacity, I'm a member of the public. And so I went through the abstracts for this morning and asked myself just one question. How many members of the public could understand what we talked about this morning? And I came to the conclusion, almost none. Because the language that we used all morning this morning is exclusionary. And so what I want to argue is that one of my biggest worries with respect to a genuine, democratic, public conversation is that those of us who care about it are simultaneously using language that excludes the very people we want to talk to, and therefore we're losing that capacity to listen.
Indeed, the word discourse is already somewhat of a block for people, language, but you set up perfectly a clip that I would like to play, and I think we're going to, it is a clip in which you are speaking, Dion. So if we could play that. It's about language.
Hi, I'm Dion Brand, and I'm the playwright for Thirsty. Well, it was very challenging to adapt the poems, or the book of poetry, Thirsty, to stage. It was, in a sense, the most adaptable book that I have, at least, to that medium, in the sense that it has a narrative through line. It's the story of a family that's, broken apart. There's a certain public moment where the husband in the family is shot by the police, and the play and the book take off from there, from what the kind of horrible turning of this very private life into this public moment, and how people adapt to that or don't adapt to it. I wanted to keep all of the poetry, basically, because I think that that kind of experience lends itself to that we can no longer speak in a public way about it, or the public language about it, but it's a very private internal language, which in a sense is the language of poetry. So the language of the poetry is maintained within the play, and the characters work with that language and trying to unwind and undo the tragedy that occurred in their life.
Thank you. I wasn't sure we'd find a moment to use the clip, but I was, because you brought up language and private and public, and also how you're talking there, Dion, about the difficulty of putting some of the public issues, in this case violence, exclusion, into a language. For you, poetry can do that. Mary works in the field of law. That is a language that's really opaque to a lot of people, right? The very strict language, how you can use words. And then Janice has now said the academic language is very difficult. So it can be a block for people. So we're talking about being publicly, speaking in public, but clearly it literally comes down to language and words. So for you, Dion, the poetry is one way of nevertheless bridging a gap that so-called public can feel vis-a-vis people who dare to use language in the public space?
Well, I mean, I'm hearing what Janice is saying about the kind of turgidity sometimes of academic language, which doesn't quite get kind of out of the room, out of the classroom, and into a kind of practice. I hear you saying that. Poetry can be accused of the same thing. However, and this is not, however, I think that people's lives are complicated, and it's okay to register them in complicated ways, right? So we're not talking about dumbing down speech, and I'm sure that's not what you're talking about, but we are talking about bringing into speech whole sets of people, or expressing in the complicated way in which it is lived, the lives of lots of people, yeah? And finding a kind of community of speech in those expressions. I write poetry that is not, that doesn't only think that it must employ a simple language because it assumes some kind of a simple audience or simplistic audience. I assume very complicated human beings who have the range of, who have a range of experiences that can be named. And those names are very complicated names. And those names are very metaphoric. And the ways of expressing that use all elements of speech and all elements of language, which contain, metaphor and trope, etc. So I try to employ all of these methods, all of these, the weaponry, if you will, bad word, of language in order to do that. I want to say that as a writer, I mean to say in the world, right? I mean to speak into the world. I've always thought this was a way of expressing a set of conditions that I experienced and that weren't being expressed, and that could use the facility, the sort of limberness, the subversive chemistry of language in order to express and to reach other people and to reach other lives and to reach common lives, similar lives. So, what have I said there? I have no idea, but I'll leave it at that.
Can I add something from the perspective of the law? One story is told about a Court of Appeal judge in Ontario who was comparing the advocacy styles and effects of two fairly well-known counsel who were both very well regarded. And he said, well, when X has finished speaking, everyone knows that he really knows his stuff. When Y has finished speaking, I feel that I really know that stuff. And I think it's really important for for any kind of discourse, for any kind of dialogue, for people to want to communicate with one another, to have a will to communicate to one another, and not just show off what they know. There has to be a meeting of the minds. And often, to do as Dion is saying and broaden the numbers of people, the groups of people who are engaged in the dialogue, we have to address ourselves to the deficiencies of the dialogic process. And Janice has identified one, and that is the mysterious language that some people like to take. Anybody who's been watching the Mayoralty so-called debates in Toronto recently knows that, they're not discourse, they're not dialogue, they're just people standing up and wailing at one another with their voices. And there are other people who are just excluded from dialogue because they don't have a way, they don't have the bus fare to get to the public hall, or they don't have, the time to engage in the dialogue because they're looking at elder care and child care and a job. And so we really need to pay attention to the kinds of spaces there are in which discourse will happen. And I think that part of our obligation, if we wish to speak on public issues, is to attend to the venue in which those speeches take place and make sure that it's inclusive.
So I agree, and that's why I brought up this issue of public space, which is something that I think maybe that's what we should do 2 years from now, is talk about public space, the spaces where we can bring people in, and the ways we can bring people in, and there's so many barriers, and so many people are excluded for different reasons. And if people aren't in the room, metaphorically, there's no dialogue, there's no listening that goes on. But I want to come back to the first issue, which is language as well. And I think, Dion, complexity doesn't mean turgid prose that excludes. And I'm going to dig in here and say that among my colleagues in the university, especially in the social sciences and in the humanities, we are losing the sensibility of the public. We are losing the language with which we can talk to the public. And we're losing the capacity to listen because there's not, as Mary says, a sincere desire to make ourselves, to learn about others, first of all, but to make ourselves understood in language that is welcoming and comfort-making, so that people who otherwise might lack confidence, feel excluded, so that we increase the level of comfort in the room. Where do we learn those skills? It's interesting. I think the university can teach you two very different things. And again, I'm going to say this in the most provocative way I can, so I don't really mean it this way, but let me say it this way. the university can prepare you very well to join the guild. Because that's what some of the exclusionary language is about. It's about building guilds which exclude everybody but the certified from the conversation, even though it's about democracy and public space. Or the university, especially if you take students seriously, can be a wonderful teacher. I taught the introductory course for 40 years at every university I've been to, and that was the best intellectual discipline I ever had because, like last night, I had 3 minutes to draw people into a subject that I cared about, because if not, they're gone. And when you and that's what it was about. Teaching is about drawing in and engaging others. It's not the lawyer who's so impressive, Mary, that it's what somebody who's participating with you can join together with you in a conversation. That's a wonderful, wonderful experience when it happens, but the disciplinary formations that we have now put in place, and frankly, it was there this morning too, exclude, they don't include.
Can I say one
Yes,
thing?
please.
I wanted to refashion the title in a way by talking a little bit about the women in Canada who are who have and are public intellectuals, and whom I've had a very kind of wonderful life with over the last 40 years or so. And those are women who are activists and who have had everything to do with the kind of intellectual work, kind of intellectual feminist work that's gone on in the country. All the women who have been in the choice movement, all the women in the birth control movement, all the women who've been in various social justice arena, working with poverty, etc. Women like Judy Rebick, who's here at the conference and who I'm looking forward to hearing later. There is a discourse that has gone on in this country over the last 40 years, led by women, that has been responsible for an enormous amount of change in the body politic. Now, sometimes we don't feel that change. We feel, oh my God, how much more work is there to be done? And sometimes when there are like reversals, you think, oh, Jesus, right? But all of the wonderful social justice work that has been done in the country has been done by women. And I've heard them in auditoriums like this, you know what I mean? Speak to other women and speak to the country. And I've also had them in Judy and I were talking on the plane yesterday about consciousness raising, where people just sat and talked about their life as women and what makes that life up, what are the component parts of it, how are state interventions in those lives, etc. And that's the learning place. Those are the intellectuals that have been responsible for an enormous amount of change in the country. So
that is the perfect, I want to say that that expresses a huge reason behind this conference. And I'll just speak to where I came at it from, which was the direction, I said a little bit of this morning, of, in particular, women writers in Canada and Quebec. So I was looking at, as a teacher, you teach the fiction work, but the stacks of nonfiction writing that contain incredible essays, reflections about, as you say, issues of social justice, around poverty, around environment, around nuclear power, in the case of Margaret Lawrence, people who have been talking about Canada, addressing the ills and issues that need to be talked about. And for me, it was just women coming from a background as writers. By working with Aretha, this opened up to women from a whole lot of different walks of life. But, so absolutely, the intelligent reflection on the country, on issues with important things to say about it, and then you step back and you say, well, we know that's the case. But then, as we saw in a paper this morning, it ends up that when you go to say, well, who has spoken on the environment, who has spoken on this, there may be 1 or 2 or 3 women in Canada whose names get named. But the legions of other women that you're talking about, that we know about, who have done that kind of work, it just doesn't bubble up to the top.
Well, there's a categorization problem here,
Yeah.
and that is, let me call it false disengagement or false neutrality, that somehow or other, in order to be considered an intellectual, especially by people who are associated with the university, you must adopt a position of disinterest
Yeah.
or disengagement
Objective.
from the fray. You must be objective. Now, a little bit of scrutiny reveals that this objectivity really isn't objective or neutral. It is simply the colorless or disappearing adoption of the majoritarian point of view. And that's what passes for neutrality. And so if you don't have that, you're not considered an intellectual. You're considered an activist. And if you're considered an activist, you do not, you don't belong to the club, and people won't listen to you. When I was teaching law at the University of Toronto, in my first round of teaching, one of my colleagues told me, well, you're not a professor, you're an activist. And I thought, well, that's true, so I left. I thought, I don't have to stand around here and take this. I can leave and go bite somebody else's ankle. So that's what I did. And, it's a bit discomforting now to find that that's still going on.
Yes.
If you are engaged, if you're passionate, if you are not simply standing back and in an august sort of fashion, reliving the majoritarian point of view, then you're not even considered an intellectual. You're considered an activist. And so you're put to the side. That has a lot to do with why the dialogue box in this country is so small. It's because those in charge of it, the self-styled monitors of intellectual discourse in this country, sort of weed a lot of people out. It's not just women who don't have economic and social privilege. I have a lot of economic and social privilege. But if I'm styled as an activist, nobody listens to me but other activists.
I'd like to talk about that box, that space, because this was a question that was pre-circulated, and again, got a little bit of, I don't know if I want to deal with this question, but let's deal with it. That space, going into it. And I, in my notes to you, was talking about how many people who are recognized as public intellectuals and who are men will say, well, I felt compelled. I had to do this. This was important. And I asked you what your experience was of going into the space, because if it is blocked and closed, it can be scary, it can be dangerous, it can be violent, it can be aggressive. And so people might not be inclined to jump into that box. So I think what we want to hear a little bit about as women who have entered that space, and I know that sounds very, very florid, entering the space, but there is a space to get into, and how do you get there?
So I'm going to disagree with my friend Mary a little bit when I answer this question. I don't think that passion excludes you from public space. Okay. I think actually most people who go into public space, whatever that is, and we need to come back to that, but most people who do it for exactly the reason that you said, Crystal, you feel compelled. You care. You're motivated. Right? Because there are not many rewards for doing so. So you do it because the issue that you're worrying about is of such overwhelming, compelling importance that you want to broaden the dialogue, you want to broaden the conversation about it. So I think virtually everybody who, let me put it this way, leads their life partly in public, I'm going to use that language, does so because they care deeply about an issue. And it is the passion which actually, one, compels people to do this, and also draws in others. It's the passion which is infectious. Often it's the door that opens to let you move to substance. So, most, I can only say this, passion overwhelms any sense of risk when it's real. And most interesting things are done by people who are really poor in their decision-making processes. Don't behave at all as we're supposed to behave. Don't pay attention to obstacles or risks. In fact, would not fit in any economic textbook at all. Right? They're blind to these kinds of considerations, but because they're passionate and it's compelling. So I don't, for me personally, I would have to go way deep into my subconscious to find a real sense of danger or risk that's attached to it. That's very different from disapproval of people that you do hear. Depending on where in the guild structures they are, you certainly hear disapproval. But my answer to that is, so what? Who cares? The issues matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I entered the public space, it's certainly out of a sense of, it was certainly out of a sense of dispossession and injustice. And so I really didn't care who was there preventing me from doing whatever it was I was trying to do. But I needed to speak this into the world and to kind of construct a person. So